Edwin Newman, inviting you to Meet the Press.
Meet the Press, America's press conference of the air and winner of every major award in its field, is a public affairs presentation of NBC News.
Our guests today on Meet the Press are the three leading candidates for mayor of New York City. William F. Buckley, Jr., editor of the National Review and candidate of the Conservative Party. John V. Lindsay, member of the House of Representatives and candidate of the Republican and Liberal parties. Abraham D. Beam, the present New York City Comptroller and the Democratic candidate. Now we'll have the first questions from Lawrence E. Spivak, permanent member of the Meet the Press panel.
Well, Mr. Buckley, your major experience has been as an editor. You've never held elective or a point of office in New York City or elsewhere, and according to a report, haven't been interested enough in New York City to vote here. Now, in view of that, will you give us a good reason why anyone should vote for you for mayor?
Well, Mr. Spivak, I should think because people do seem to believe that something is wrong in New York, something is critically wrong in New York, and seem to be dissatisfied with the performance of people who have boasted of their professional qualifications. As regards the technical matter of my residency in New York, I face no problems that Bobby Kennedy didn't face. I haven't heard many complaints about his performance since being elected senator from New York, and my ties to New York are at least as old as his.
You've said repeatedly that you were the only authentic Republican in the race, yet you didn't enter the Republican primary, presumably because you thought you couldn't win. You can't win this election, according to the current polls, yet you may very well defeat the Republican candidate. So what, in your opinion, has the Republican Party and the city gained through your candidacy?
Well, what they have to gain, Mr. Whalen, is some hope for the future of the two-party system in this city and in this state. You have written, I think, the finest book on the deterioration of New York, A City Destroying Itself, which I read with some care and which informed me a great deal, and which, among other things, suggests the utter political paralysis of this city as a result of the dominance over it of a single political entity, the Liberal Party. I maintain that the voters are going to show on November the 2nd that there are conservatives in New York who are interested in political realism, who don't believe in bloc voting, who don't believe in pandering to powerful forces, whether they are labor union or whatever. And under the circumstances, my intention is to liberate them so that they, in turn, can liberate the Republican Party. If there was a conclusive argument against a fourth party, it should have been used against the Liberal Party as being founded 20 years ago.
When you entered the race for mayor, Life magazine quoted you as saying, and I quote, "I don't want people to vote for me because of what I am. I want them to vote for a set of principles." Now, what are some of these principles that you want people to vote for?
Some of these principles, Mr. Spivak, have primarily to do with the necessity to recognize realism. For instance, it is impossible simultaneously in New York to give people any kind of economic freedom, any kind of economic hope, and continue to squander their money at the pace at which it has been spent by the Wagner administration, which managed to double the budget during the course of its tenure. It is impossible to have good education in New York when we are supposed primarily to worry over the problem of integrating the schools. It is impossible to do anything in New York without hurting the feelings of somebody else, whether it's unsnarling the traffic jam or whether it's taming the arrogant labor union leaders. It is necessary, in other words, to stop fawning on the bloc voters and insist that if there are to be any solutions in New York, they have got to be approached with the kind of political courage that Mr. Lindsay, unfortunately, is so disgracefully lacking in. Decency and good government call, among other things, for repudiating people like Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., calls, among other things, for repudiating people like Harry von Arsdale, who sets his goons to working against taxis who don't oblige him by unionizing. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Mr. Buckley, you once called Harry Truman the nation's most conspicuous vulgarian. You said of General Eisenhower that when he touches a subject, every ray of light, every breath of air is choked out. Of the Kennedy administration, I quote you, "There are not enough psychiatrists in the country to cure this crazy administration." And you've called President Johnson Uncle Cornpone.
In view of your opinions of the last 4 presidents of the United States...
Actually, I didn't say that about Kennedy. I don't know who did. I said the other 3, though.
Right.
I'd be glad to elaborate on it.
Well, in view of your opinions of 3 of the last 4 presidents, then, what do you think of the American voter?
Well, I think the American voter is often has intuitions which are better than those of their own presidents. That is to say, I think that presidents during the recent period, tend to have drawn more strength from the voters than the voters from their presidents. As Franklin Adams once said, I think the average American is a little bit above average. And under the circumstances, I rejoice over the influence of the people over their elected leaders, since by and large I think that they show more wisdom than their leaders or than their intellectuals. I've often been quoted as saying I would rather be governed by the first 2,000 people in the Boston Telephone Directory than by the 2,000 people on the faculty of Harvard University.
Mr. Buckley, you've talked a great deal about principles in this campaign. Wouldn't you agree that Mr. Lindsay's position in the 1964 election, to which you've taken such sharp exception, was an example of principle in politics, and that further your own principles are closer to those of Governor Wallace of Alabama and that faction of the Democratic Party than they are to the apparently dominant leadership of the Republican Party?
No, I wouldn't agree with the last part of your statement. I think it would have been perfectly principled for Mr. Lindsay last year to say, I can't stand it. I've been surrounded by Republicans for 5 years now, and the situation is so sticky that I've got to cross the aisle and join the Democratic Party. That's what a man of principle, in my judgment, would have done. I don't think it's principle at all to expect the Republican Party to work for you, but to decline to work for the nominee of the Republican Party when the Republican Party has a national convention and designates a leader. If Mr. Lindsay were to attempt to reconcile principle with his own activities, he would become, as Mr. Harriman so recently urged him to be, a Democrat, in which case your own support of him, Mr. Wexler, would also come more naturally.
Mr. Buckley, will you draw any solace from the defeat of Mr. Lindsay?
No, here's what I would draw solace from. That for the first time, there will have been demonstrated that there is in New York sufficient people to embolden those legislators in Albany or in City Hall or in Washington who want to vote conservative but feel that if they do so, they're going to come back and be executed by the liberal machines that dominate these 2 gentlemen. I want them to surface. They can only do so by voting for me, so that the whole nature of politics in New York State will change, so that they will know that there are people there who will support them in the coming elections.
Mr. Buckley, you have had the last word. I'm sorry I have to cut us off here because our time is up. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today on Meet the Press. This is Edwin Newman saying goodbye for William Buckley, John Lindsay, Abraham Beam, and Meet the Press.